Here in this quiet town in the Greek countryside, someone riding a bicycle is nothing out of the ordinary. So when Indiana Jones comes cycling by this town one morning, he wouldn't have attracted much attention, if not for the fact that he was being chased by army vehicles with mounted machine guns. Now that turns some heads. Welcome to the Indiana Jones Lorecast, where we delve into the lore and the history of the Indiana Jones franchise. Hello everyone, and welcome to the show. In this episode, we will be covering Indiana Jones and the Golden Fleece, another comic from the Dark Horse published comics. This one is one of their shorter stories, and therefore we will be able to cover it in its entirety in this episode, so that's great. And it's got some great locations in it, some great action scenes, and also some pretty crazy stuff, so I hope you're all excited to get into it. It is certainly an incredibly interesting one, so let us begin. Our story opens up with snow, howling winds, a blizzard. From the snow, figures emerge, figures in hooded robes, and beneath a dead snow-covered tree lies a sheep, a ram. It is trapped in the storm. We then see that the ram is surrounded by these hooded figures, and from beneath one of their cloaks is pulled an ornate dagger. We are then shown blood spilling onto the snow-covered ground. So right out of the gate, a pretty heavy intro. Our story then takes us to Greece, in the Peloponnesian Peninsula, and this comic actually has a pretty cool feature when it comes to the storytelling, and that is that it uses excerpts from the memoirs of Indiana Jones to serve as the narration for the story. It's a pretty cool way to move the story forward. The scene that we see in Greece is one of panic and disarray. The year is 1941, and Indiana Jones is in Greece to act as an advisor on an American archaeological expedition, which has been sanctioned by the Greek government. Now, however, the dig site is being evacuated, as the Nazi war machine sweeps across the Greek countryside, pushing back the British Defence Forces which had just arrived in the country. We see that the dig site workers and archaeology teams are being hurriedly escorted by the British Army onto a beach, where there are boats waiting to take them to safety. In one of the arriving trucks, an older gentleman who seems to have some level of authority over the expedition is expressing his outrage, saying how they can't just be dragged off of their excavation site, that the work they were doing is too important. They had found an ancient king's tomb and palace, possibly containing the treasure of Atreus. This is in reference to the ancient king called Atreus in ancient tales. The man, whose name is Malcolm, argues with a British colonel about all of this, with the colonel saying that there'll be Germans all over these hills pretty soon. And, the man says, Dr. Jones, talk some sense into this idiot. And there, seated in the truck with them, is Indiana Jones, who has a grim look on his face. He simply says that they should do as the colonel says. Malcolm says that the site was just left exposed and that all their work could fall into the hands of the Nazis, but Indy reminds him that their team is made up of students. They're just kids, as he says, and they can't subject them to that kind of danger. And as Indy is helping escort the team to the boats, Malcolm is saying how he's bitterly disappointed in Indy, that he would put petty politics before his profession. While Malcolm is saying all of this, he is not paying attention to the sound which is slowly growing around them. It is the roaring of plane engines, as from the clouds, German dive bombers descend on the beach. Indy runs and tackles Malcolm to the ground, narrowly avoiding being hit by one of the falling bombs as it detonates nearby, blowing a large crater into the beach with a deafening bang. Sand rains down upon Indy, who is now lying on top of Malcolm, face to face with him, as he shouts, "This is not politics, Malcolm. This is war." With Malcolm replying, "I'm beginning to see your point." Indy continues making sure that the whole team is evacuated and that everyone is accounted for. As you can imagine, everything is kind of a mad scramble after the bombing run. So once the boats begin to depart, Indy then turns and begins walking back up the beach, with Malcolm of course asking what he's doing. He tells Malcolm firstly to close his mouth or he'll catch flies, and he then reaches into his satchel and pulls out his hat. Putting it on, he says that if the treasure of Atreus is in that tomb, then someone will have to beat the Nazis there tonight. So as Malcolm, their team, and the soldiers evacuate the beach, he heads alone back up into the countryside. We then skip ahead a few hours. The moon is high in the sky, and in the abandoned dig site, deep in the ruin, Indy works at finding whatever is hidden inside. After a while, he is able to enter the burial vault to find that it had been robbed, and not recently, mind you. The robbing of this tomb happened many years ago evidently, as the skeleton of one of the grave robbers lies on the floor, with a sword still protruding from its ribcage. The sword looks to be something from the golden age of piracy. It's one of those kind of swords. So clearly this guy's friend didn't want to split the loot. Greed is nothing new to the human race. Indy hasn't lost all hope, however, after seeing this, as these grave robbers might not have taken everything. They might have missed something. He spends time in the tomb, he follows clues written on a wall in ancient writing, and comes to a stone slab on the floor after following some cryptic instructions. He then pries open this stone slab with the sword, which he takes from the unfortunate skeleton. Beneath the stone slab he finds a dagger, which he determines to be from ancient Colchis, where, according to Greek literature, the mythological hero Jason claimed the Golden Fleece. The Golden Fleece is the fleece of a winged ram with golden wool. This ram was sacrificed to Zeus, and its fleece was passed down through history as an artifact. So, having found this dagger, Indy makes his way out of the ruin, and his memoirs state that Apollo had already ridden his chariot into the sky, which is just a very cool sort of on-theme way of saying that the sun had risen. Upon exiting the ruin, Indy sees a German soldier who is unaware of him, but then all the other German soldiers outside the ruin see Indy. So he acts quick. He quickly grabs the first soldier from behind and holds a large rock in one hand, threatening to use it if necessary. The German army had sent engineers overnight, as they are now setting up an airstrip outside the excavation site. The soldiers all come running towards the commotion, pointing their guns at Indy, who thankfully now has one of their own as a hostage. Something cool that I'd like to bring up here is Indy's, telling them, stay back, or the man gets it, I'm not fooling around. But below the panel, it actually says that is being translated from German. So Indy is actually speaking German to these soldiers. Again, he knows so many languages, so it's just a cool little thing I wanted to bring up there. Indy's threats to these soldiers are cut short, however, as the commanding officer tells him that his use of the man as a shield is futile, as every German soldier is willing to lay down his life for the fatherland, and the officer then draws his pistol and shoots the man dead in Indy's arms. And as the man slumps to the ground, Indy just says, "Geez." I mean, I can't argue with that response, to be honest, but he's then told, right, you're next, and he very quickly ducks and dives down the hillside and takes off running, with the soldiers giving chase. At this point, Indy's memoirs explain that, quote, "I had lived through many a chase before that day, and dodged many a spear, arrow, and bullet, but it had been a long time since I'd ridden a bike," end quote, as he sees a bicycle upon reaching the bottom of the hill just kind of up by a tree, and so he just grabs it and takes off riding on it. And he's riding as fast as he can, of course, as bullets hit the ground all around him from the pursuing Germans. And we see that Indy then rides into a town, and we see that a German vehicle begins to chase after him with a mounted machine gun on the back, as they had been radioed in about what was happening. And the memoirs continue, quote, "It was true though, you really don't forget how to ride one," end quote. it's strange. I mean, I assumed you'd never forget. I don't know who would forget how to ride a bicycle, but it's just kind of odd. I'd never heard of that saying before this story, before reading it, so it's pretty interesting. He cycles up through the streets, huffing and puffing, as tire screeching and machine gun fire disrupts the quiet morning. And I just hope that no one had plans to sleep in that morning, because certainly not happening now. After riding down a staircase and face-planting, he takes off running, as the bike now appears to be mangled and bent after that little stunt. The Germans go door to door, searching for him. Any civilians who harbour the enemy will be killed, as they explain. They see a woman in one of the houses, and so kick her door in and question her, and after they're done, they move on. This woman then goes back inside her house and opens a barrel of olive oil and says, quickly, get out, they might be coming back. And Indy then emerges from this barrel. Just gross. I imagine you would have to shower for hours to get all of that oil off of you. Honestly, being caught might have been preferable. That's my humble opinion anyway. The woman's name is Omphale, and she is heavily pregnant. She asks Indy where he's from, and he tells her that he's American. Dr. Jones, Barnet College, but Indy will do just fine, as he tells her. Also, when he asks her how she knows English so well, she explains that her father ran a small cargo plane business when she was younger and flew to many different countries, and she would accompany him on these trips and so picked up all these different languages, which is really cool. She then says to him, so you need to get out of Greece, right? Good, I come with you. He says to her, whoa, wait a minute, what about your husband? And she says that her husband took off, deserted the army, and left her. She says, quote, he's a weasel, real son of a bitch. He tells her, wow, you do have command over the language, and she hurriedly packs her things in a bag and they both leave her house. They reach the town's docks to find a boat. The boats all lie half sunk and in pieces, as the Germans had bombed them all. Indy tells Omphale to wait while he sees if he can salvage something. While crawling around from ship to ship, Indy is suddenly ambushed by hooded figures who tackle him. They are shrieking and frothing at the mouth. They're also speaking Turkish, and searching Indy's satchel. They then find the dagger, the one from the ruin, and one of them raises it to stab Indy, rambling about the goddess Hecate and the fleece, when suddenly a loud crack is heard as a bullet hits this cultist in the arm. They all begin to flee as Omphale comes running down the embankment holding a revolver, shouting that she'll kill them if they don't let him go. The cultists run and climb aboard a seaplane that they had waiting for them. As they take off, Indy and Omphale see that they might be flying towards Istanbul based on their direction. Indy has a contact in Istanbul, who happens to be a world-class authority on the Golden Fleece and the laws surrounding it. Indy wonders if this is coincidence, serendipity, or fate. He thanks Omphale, saying that she's saved him twice now. He then gets an idea on how they're going to get to Istanbul to follow the cultists and meet Indy's contact. Back at the airstrip at the ruin, an engineer is knocked unconscious as he works on one of the planes. Indy sneaks up to this plane, but a second German soldier sees him, but as he tries to shoot Indy, Omphale sneaks up and knocks the soldier out from behind with a tree branch. That's 3 times. This is getting to be a habit, she says to a shocked Indy. The rest of the airstrip is now descending upon the pair, so they quickly climb into the plane with Omphale taking the controls, as she tells Indy that she learned to fly a plane from her trips with her father. They take off, with the soldiers trying to shoot them down. Once they're up in the clouds, they keep an eye out for any pursuit. Omphale asks Indy what his name is all about. He explains that it's short for Indiana, and she goes, why would a parent name their child Indiana? Isn't that an American province? And he tells her, well, states. We call them states, and it's a nickname. She replies by simply saying, stupid nickname. Gosh, okay. So the conversation then ends as they catch sight of the seaplane far ahead of them. The German fighter plane that they are now flying is way faster, so they'll be able to catch up with no problem. Or at least they would have if not for the trio of German planes that now have appeared behind them and begin firing at them. This is one of those planes with a seat behind the pilot for the gunner to sit and use the machine gun, and Indy takes control of this gun and begins shooting at the other planes. Omphale dives their plane below the others as Indy fires up at them and one of them explodes. As the bullets strike the side of the plane right near where Indy is sitting, he shouts, "That was beautiful, Omphale, now do something else." And she sends the plane into a downward barrel roll. And he's like, "Your father taught you how to barrel roll?" And she says, "I am brotherless. He had no choice." You know, what else is a father to do in that situation? Indy continues to fire at the two remaining planes, crippling the one's wing, which causes it to fly into the other one. The two collide in an explosion of wings and bolts. The danger was not over, however, as their plane had been heavily damaged during the dogfight. They are losing altitude. They plummet towards the Dardanelles, coastal cliffs, and the very place in Greek tales where Helle had fallen to her death from the golden ram as her and her brother flew to Colchis upon its back. Indy's memoirs tell us that he'd like to say that the irony of his predicament was not lost on him, but in that moment it was. Omphale asks him if he thinks they'll die. He just replies, "Yeah." As they approach the cliffside, Omphale struggles against the dying plane to get it to turn. She just about manages to turn in time, with the plane banking on its side and barely avoiding a sudden and fiery end against the side of the cliff. And Indy is shouting from behind her, "Just don't hit the cliffs, or the rocks, or the water," and she tells him to shut down, which is pretty funny. She obviously meant to say shut up, but still getting the hang of how to say these things in English. Anyway, the plane dips low and skirts along the water for a few terrifying moments, before finally the horrific stunt is over, and she is able to regain control of the plane somewhat, and they are able to continue flying low above the sea, for now. He says to her, "You did it," and she says, "Of course, I am one tough cracker," and he says, You mean tough cookie," and yes, you are. As they make their way to Istanbul, we are gonna hop over to the mid-show break real quick. I'll see you there.
Snakes. Why did it have to be snakes?
Why, hello there, and welcome to the mid-show break, a section in the middle of the episode for me to quickly discuss the show itself and other relevant things in general. Firstly, hi, I'm your host, Kel, or Sir Bandit, and thank you very much for tuning in. If you're enjoying the show, you can support it by sharing it with a friend, or leaving a rating or review on whichever platform you listen on. And it really helps the show and helps it reach more people. This is also the part of the show where I read out any 5-star reviews on Apple Podcasts. So if you rate the show 5 stars on Apple Podcasts and leave a review along with it, I'll be reading it out on a future episode. If you'd like to reach out, then feel free to do so. You can find me on the Robots Radio Discord, where there is a dedicated Indiana Jones Lorecast channel. So come say hi, we'd love to see you there. So without any further delay, let's continue our story.
I'm going after that truck. Oh. I don't know, I'm making this up as I go.
The plane arrives finally in Istanbul. They are forced to just crash land into the shallow water, and Indy helps Omphale out of the plane as it bubbles and sinks. Upon entering the city, they meet Indy's friend, a Dutchman by the name of Daan van Rooyen, an antiques dealer. He is a thin man with short white hair and round glasses. They sit down with him and ask him about a symbol which was on both the dagger which Indy found in Greece as well as tattooed on the arm of one of the cultists. The symbol is pretty much a capital Y with a second upside down capital Y above it, with the outstretched arms of the two Ys intersecting in the middle. Don explains that the symbol represents a soul reaching out and intersecting with salvation coming from above. This symbol has two things in common: the Golden Fleece and the cult of Hecate, which is one of the names for the goddess associated with both life and death, as well as some other things. Don takes a book from his bookshelf which depicts the myth surrounding the fleece, as he explains further. It was Hecate, disguised as a shade of Nephili, who created the magical golden ram in order to save the siblings Phrixus and Helle. This ram was later sacrificed to Zeus by the Colchians, and a huge serpent was supposed to guard the tree where they had hung the fleece after the sacrifice. This fleece was said to be ageless and indestructible, and bring prosperity and victory to whoever possessed it. When the hero Jason took it from Colchis and returned it to his homeland, their civilization thrived, but over the centuries it slipped from the hands of the Greeks, as it moved between the Romans, Byzantines, and eventually fell into the hands of the Ottoman Empire. Then, in the 16th century, something horrible happened. A man named Salim the Sot, who was a sultan, became enraged at the crying of his youngest child in the harem, and he then used the Golden Fleece to smother the infant. The fleece had been desecrated, and so it lost its magical properties, and from that point it all went downhill for the Ottoman Empire. At hearing this, Omphale is looking through the book with a look of shock and disgust on her face, as she places her one hand on her stomach, probably without even realizing she's doing it. This is an upsetting story, of course, but it's obviously hitting really close to home for her, given her current situation. Dawn explains that the fleece, after it was discovered to have lost its power, was most likely thrown into some dusty storage room and is still hidden away in Istanbul till this day, and he has been trying to track it down for years. He has a lead though, a photo from an auction in the 1920s. In this photo, a bunch of antiques and artifacts can be seen, and all of these artifacts had been tracked down by Don, except for one, a ram's fleece, which can be seen sitting amongst the other auction pieces in the background. Omphale asks who the cult of Hecate are, and Don says that they are radical and fanatical Turks who aren't happy with the fate of their country, and they long for the glory days of the Ottoman Empire. They aim to reconsecrate the fleece at the site of its original sacrifice, using the dagger found in Atreus' tomb, the one they took from Indy. Now that they know what the cult is up to, it's just a matter of finding the fleece before they do, as the cult already has the dagger. That night, Indy and Dawn travel to a public records building of some kind to access the transcript from that auction. They had to bribe some officials to be allowed in, and they now stand with flashlights looking through boxes of documents in a large empty hall filled with shelves. Eventually, Dawn finds the transcript that they need. He doesn't have time to see where the fleece ended up though, as a group of men enter the room and begin shooting at them. Indy pushes the shelf over onto one of them and the pair run for the staircase. They come out onto the roof of the building and run and jump across to the next roof, which is one of those domed roofs with a point at the top. I'm sure you know what I'm talking about. They land and begin slipping down the steep slope of the dome, and just before they fall, Indy takes out his whip and uses it to grab the point at the top of the roof. He holds the whip with one hand and the panicking Mr. Van Rooyen in the other as they hang there, being shot at from the rooftop they just leapt from. Indy sees that there is a cart of melons being wheeled on the street below them, and so makes the decision to let his whip go. and they plummet down roughly 3 or 4 stories and land with a splat and a crash into the melon cart, with the salesman yelling at them. I'm sure you can imagine they aren't happy. At this point, Indy's memoirs say, quote, "I hated losing my whip. It was almost a part of me. I never dreamed how it would return." Interesting. Keep that in mind for later. Later, the 2 men sit under a bridge to examine the transcript. Though it doesn't mention what happened to the fleece, the man who acted as the secretary for the auction is someone Don actually knows, another dealer of antiques and other little odds and ends. They collect Omphale from the apartment as it's no longer safe to leave her alone, and head through the merchant district to follow their lead. Upon finding and entering the shop, the man is friendly towards them and happy to share what he remembered of that particular auction. He happens to remember exactly what happened to that ram's fleece which is shown in the photograph. He remembers because no one wanted to buy such a dusty, moth-eaten old thing, so he took it home himself and used the backside of it as a canvas for a painting that he did. A painting that still hangs on his wall. Indy takes it down from the wall and they all stare at it in awe, as the man remarks that still nobody wants to buy it, even though it is now in the form of a painting, and that's why it's still here in the shop. He is then left speechless as Indy and Don both thrust handfuls of cash at him, so that business turned out well for him, and they now have the painting. Indy wanted to leave with the fleece as quick as possible, but Don wanted to be sure that it was the real deal, so they head back to his apartment to run some tests and to pick up some books that Don needed. At the apartment, they try cutting it, they try burning it, and it remains unscathed. This is the real thing. Kind of a shame though that the fleece has been painted all over on the backside, but I suppose it can be removed somehow. Not that they need to do that, it just bothers me personally. That would have been my top priority, and I suppose the cult would have just caught me while I'm trying to still scrub all of that off. But anyway, they are all excited and in disbelief, obviously, and Don pours drinks for everybody to celebrate. Also, while he does this, Omphale says to Indy that she's so happy for him, and then leans in and gives him a quick kiss, so ooh la la, as the ancient Greeks used to say. While they all drink to their success, Don says he just gives this whole speech about the fleece, saying, "Imagine, the stuff of mythology, tangible, mine." And Indy says to him, "Wait, what do you mean? This thing needs to be in a museum. It belongs in a museum." It's pretty much his catchphrase. And he tells him that it should be in a museum or university, or safely out of reach of the cult or anyone else with ill intentions. And Don then pushes him back onto the couch, telling him to shut up and sit down. Omphale doesn't help Indy, because she is feeling suddenly drowsy, and for that matter, so does Indy. Oh dear. As they slip into unconsciousness, Don explains that it's a simple paralytic, nothing lethal. Against his better judgment, he won't kill them, as he puts it. By the time they recover, he'll be long gone with the fleece. He believes that fate has brought the fleece to him and that Hecate will watch over him. He rolls up the fleece and leaves the room. When Indy and Omphale come to, Indy says that they need to go after Don before he gets too far, because he's presumably gotten quite the head start. They stumble down the stairs, and in the dark they see someone slumped up against the wall. It's Don. The cult got him. The symbol of the cult has been cut into his cheek, and he had been strangled with a whip. Indy's whip. So there it is, the crazy way that it found its way back to him in the story. I would have been over the moon to get my whip back, but just gross. But I mean, as we'll see as we cover more stories, this is not the only time that his whip strangles somebody. So now the cult has the dagger and the fleece. They are on their way to Colchis right now for the reconsecration and to invoke their goddess, no doubt. Omphale says that what the cult is doing is wrong and that they have to go stop them, but Indy says to her at this point that she can't go with him this time, and that he's putting his foot down. And as Indy's memoirs then say, quote, "I still don't know who was more stubborn, Omphale or the mules that she used," end quote. As we see that Omphale has indeed come along with him anyway. Them and their pack mules travel alongside the Black Sea on their way to Colchis, and as they do so we see that unfortunately one of the mules falls through a rope bridge that they're crossing, and Omphale almost gets taken along with it, as she dangles from the rope bridge and Indy has to save her. After following directions from locals and finding some ancient runes carved into the stone, they eventually come upon the Valley of Hecate, and upon approaching the site of the sacrifice they see that there seems to be a raging blizzard localized to just that spot. Indy remarks that there are strange forces at work here. The valley is cursed, and Omphale is distressed. As they get closer, Omphale is clearly in pain, and Indy sees ahead of them that the cult has gathered around a tree where the fleece now hangs from one of the branches, and one of them pierces the fleece with the dagger, and they're of course all chanting, as you can imagine. And now, strap in everybody, because the end of this one is pretty wild. So Omphale is having her baby. First problem. Here and now. Because of course she is. So she collapses and is trying to do all that she can on her own as Indy approaches the cultists. But something is wrong. The baby is turned, and she needs help. So she calls out to Indy, and the cultists see that they are there. So Indy is now stuck between trying to save the world and also help deliver this baby in a blizzard. This is certainly something that can go on his resume. Very impressive indeed. As he gets down to help Omphale, he tells her that he's going to try to turn the baby, and to just hang on. The cultists advance on them while this is happening, and the memoirs say, quote, "I didn't have the time to argue the sanctity of motherhood with a couple of ghouls," end quote, as we see Indy punching one of the cultists in the face and begins fighting off the others. Now, at this point, Hecate makes herself known. Enraged with centuries of abuse and desecration, she, the goddess, conspired with elemental nature, essentially allowing two births to take place in this moment. One is the birth of Omphale's baby, and the second comes bursting from the ground at the sacrificial site. As Indy puts it, the biggest snake I've ever seen. And I'm sure he's loving this. And big is definitely an understatement. This thing that comes out of the ground is easily around 30 meters long, or 100 feet, more or less, with two small limbs on its torso. The cultists all begin panicking and fleeing, but Indy is sort of stuck there, marveling at this beast behind him, but also having to help deliver the baby, with the snowy storm winds intensifying all around them. And using his knife, he cuts and ties the cord once the baby is finally out, telling Omphale that it's a healthy baby boy. But then, suddenly, he looks behind him, up towards this giant serpent. And his memoirs say, quote, "For the life of me, I still don't know why I did what I did next. Call it the hand of Hecate, call it weird. It was the only thing that made sense, somehow." End quote. Indy then stands up and holds the baby up to the serpent, and pleads for Hecate to honor the birth of this pure and innocent child, and to take back what is hers. And In this moment, I thought that Indy was straight up going to give the baby to Hecate, or to the snake, but thankfully that is not the case. As we see a bright light begin to emit from the snake as it slowly rises into the sky with, stay with me here, with the form of Hecate herself coming down from the swirling clouds. The cultists are all consumed by some sort of light or fire which seems to char or disintegrate them. The form of the goddess and the snake, after a bright spectacle, disappear. The storm is lifted from the valley, and the fleece now hangs bright and golden upon the tree branch. It then morphs into the form of the golden ram itself, and ascends into the sky, into the arms of its loving and awaiting mother. Hecate has taken back what is hers. After the whole ordeal, Indy, Omphale, and her baby make their way down the path out of the valley, and Omphale says that she knows what she's going to name her baby, and Indy, hearing this, smiles and says, "Oh shucks, don't tell me. You're going to name him after me, that's really sweet." And she says, "No, not Indiana, Nikos. Indy is a stupid name." And our story closes out with them leaving the valley, which is peaceful once again. This story was certainly interesting. I enjoyed the locations and set pieces, as I said. The artifact was also great. I enjoyed their tracking down of the fleece and the history behind it. I mean, as far as artifacts go, you can't go wrong with one from Greek mythology. That was great. The action was also brilliant. I loved the utilization of the whip and the role that it played in the story. The plane fight was nuts, and Omphale had an interesting role in the story. And this is something that I'd like to bring up here. In episode 3 of this show, where I discussed the origins of Indiana Jones, I mentioned that Indiana Jones was first put forward to Steven Spielberg in conversation as an alternative to directing a James Bond film. And there are actually some influences and some similarities between Indiana Jones and James Bond. We will cover some of these similarities in future episodes when they come up, but one of these similarities is the fact that in pretty much every Indiana Jones story there is a new lady, a new potential love interest. There is always this air of suspense and tension between him and the lead lady of the story. The whole will they, won't they type of thing. There are some exceptions to this, but for the most part, this is how the stories go. But what I like about the Indiana Jones stories that we've covered so far is I believe that they treat their female characters with respect. The ladies in these stories are smart, independent, strong women, without becoming too overbearing as characters, because that can happen if it's handled poorly. But I believe that they are handled very well. There is a nice amount of banter and back and forth between them, and it's less about comparisons than it is about just complimenting each other as characters. And these are characters who showcase the fact that being tough and being feminine are not opposites, but in fact complement each other very well when done correctly. And Omphale, I believe, definitely showcased this. The fact that she was so heavily involved in the action while being so heavily pregnant is insane. Probably unhealthy, but still pretty cool. But yes, it was a very enjoyable part of this story. The ending of the story was certainly something. The panel that shows the giant snake floating up into the sky with the goddess above it is a panel that I'd like to show someone without any context and see what they think. Though, to be honest, knowing the full context makes it no less crazy. Certainly an eventful and tense climax though. But if I can offer some advice when it comes to going through the Indiana Jones stories is not to get too stuck up on what's realistic and what's not. I mean, of course, you can interact with the series however you'd like to. It's just I've found that I've enjoyed it most when just accepting the fun aspect of it. I brought up in the episode covering the origins of Indiana Jones, where I go through the whole conceptualization of how the character came to be, all that sort of thing. I mentioned how it's very much inspired by that serial type of adventure, where it's the adventure of the week. This week he's doing this, that week he's doing that, and all of them are crazy and wildly different, and it's just all so fun. That's what it is to me at the end of the day. It's just really fun. So, with all that being said, that is the end of this episode. Thank you all so much for listening, and if you have any questions, you can find me in my office. But until then, remember, aerial dogfights while heavily pregnant are not advisable. I'll see you all next time. Thanks for listening to the Indiana Jones Lorecast. If you like what you hear and want to support the show, then drop a rating or review wherever you're listening. I'll see you next time.